Hey everybody, it's Lon.TV, and we're taking a look today at the new Google Pixel 5. This is Google's latest top-end smartphone, the second one they've released so far this year. And we're going to be taking a closer look at this phone and what it's all about in just a second. But I do want to let you know, in the interest of full disclosure, this came in free of charge from Google. However, all the opinions you're about to hear are my own. No one is paying for this review, nor is anyone reviewing it or approving it before it gets uploaded. So let's get into it now and see what this new phone is all about. Now, the price point on this is $699. Unlike last year's Pixel 4, though, there's only one version available, which is this one, a 6-inch device. They do not have a larger one now. This is running with an OLED display, though, a really nice one, 2340 by 1080. Great color, nice and crisp, awesome black levels and contrast on it. I'm very pleased with it, also very minimal bezels as well. The display is running at 90 hertz, too, so it's very snappy and responsive with minimal input latency as you're scrolling around different things here. Now, oddly, they didn't make this an upgrade in performance, though, over the last edition. So this is running with a Qualcomm 765G processor, and as you'll see in a few minutes, it's a performance downgrade versus the Pixel 4, which really surprised me. We'll step through some benchmarks in a bit so you can see just how much of a step down in performance it is. But it does support 5G. So if you're in one of the limited areas with 5G support, you'll be able to make use of that faster network with this phone. But otherwise, it really will be a performance downgrade over the prior edition. It does, though, have 8 gigabytes of RAM on board, which is great. It also has 128 gigabytes of storage, which is also good, but you cannot upgrade the storage with an SD card. So whatever you buy here is what you're going to get. I don't believe there is a larger capacity option available at the moment either. There are 2 colors available. This one is the Sorta Sage, kind of a green color here, really nice. The phone is aluminum here on the back, but they put a coating over it, so it sort of feels like plastic, but it is in fact a higher quality build versus the Pixel 4a, which I'll compare this to in a minute. And the other color option you can get for the back here is black. Google calls that just black. The phone supports wireless charging. We tested it with a Qi charger a little bit earlier. And another neat thing you can do with it is use the phone as a wireless charger. So right now I have the battery share feature activated, and if I place my iPhone down on top of it here, you can see that my iPhone is charging wirelessly off the Pixel 5. So you can have peaceful coexistence here between iOS and Android without issues. One can charge the other. Now, the weight on this one is 151 grams or 5.3 ounces, not all that heavy. It is water resistant, IP68 rated, which means that if you were to drop it into a toilet or a puddle or something, it'll probably not get any water damage, but it's not meant to be immersed in water for long periods of time. So I wouldn't take it swimming without a waterproof case, for example, but by and large, you shouldn't have issues with splashes or rain or anything else like that. Now, they simplified this phone quite a bit from the prior edition. So last year's phone, the Pixel 4, had this fancy radar sensor on the front. It had facial recognition for unlocking the phone and no fingerprint reader. This one, they went back to basics. So there is no facial recognition this year, no radar sensor. They do, though, have a fingerprint reader here on the back that is very similar to what we've seen on phones for many years now. Nothing fancy, but it very quickly gets you in. So if I turn the phone off here and tap my finger, you can see it's pretty instantaneous to detect that fingerprint and let you in there. Nothing fancy, but it gets the job done. You don't have a headphone jack on this one, oddly enough. And the funny thing is that the Pixel 4a, the lower end phone, does have the headphone jack. So you will have to use Bluetooth headphones. Google will gladly sell you their new wireless earbuds here as well if you prefer those, but you're going to have to connect something other than a standard headphone connector to get audio out of the device into a headset. You can also use the USB-C port here at the bottom. You can get a USB-C to headphone adapter. This port will also work with data devices like memory sticks and that sort of thing. It also is what you use to charge the phone, and it'll support the faster USB-C power delivery. But this does not support display out, so you can't plug it into a monitor with a USB-C cable, but everything else on USB-C here is supported. Now, the battery life on this new phone is much better than the prior edition. If you're not doing anything too strenuous with the phone, mostly sticking to a few phone calls every once in a while, occasional checks of email and that sort of thing, you should easily be able to get through the day. You can often squeeze out a little bit more battery life if you turn the display brightness down. All in, much better performance than the prior edition. Your mileage, of course, will vary based on what you're doing, how far you are from cell towers, but I think if you were unhappy with battery life out of the Pixel phone before, this new one certainly improves upon that. Now, if you're out shopping for a Pixel 5, you might have also stumbled across the Pixel 4a. These two phones actually feel very similar to each other, but there are some differences that might not be apparent just by their appearance. So the first thing that's very noticeable is that the Pixel 5 has a larger display, 6 inches versus 5.8. And as you can see here, the Pixel 5's bezels are much thinner. Both of these, though, have OLED displays, and I was very pleased with the quality of the Pixel 4a's display for its price point. But again, the 5 is a little better and larger, given that it is a more expensive phone. The 5's display runs at 90 Hertz, whereas the 4a runs at 60. So that's a difference there. You have wireless charging on the Pixel 5, which you don't get on the 4a. The Pixel 5 is water resistant, which the 4a is not. You have a little bit more RAM here on the 5, 8 gigabytes versus 6 gigabytes. So if you're doing a lot of multitasking, this one will perform a little bit better. But as you'll see in a few minutes, there are some areas where they perform very close to each other. You'll probably get a little better battery life out of the Pixel 5 due to its larger battery. It also has an aluminum backing here versus the plastic backing on the 4a, so I think the build quality feels slightly better on the more expensive phone. And then, of course, the camera system is different. So they do actually share a sensor for the regular camera. So the Pixel 4a has a single camera. It's got a 12.2 megapixel sensor running at f1.7. And that's the same camera that is on this one. But the second camera on here is a wide-angle lens, which the 4a does not have. And the resolution of the wide-angle camera here on the 5 is 16 megapixels. It has an f2.2 aperture and a 107-degree field of view. Now, last year's flagship Google phone, the Pixel 4, also had two cameras, but the second camera was a telephoto lens versus the ultra-wide on this year's model. So if you're zooming in on stuff on the Pixel 4, it's going to look better than it will on the 5. But again, this one has a wide-angle lens that is lacking on the Pixel 4. So you'll have to pick and choose which lenses you want. You're not going to get all three like you might on other flagship phones. And like the Pixel 4a, the Pixel 5 has a little punched-out front-facing camera here in the upper left-hand corner. That is an 8-megapixel f2.0 camera here on the front, the same as what you'll get on the lower-cost 4a. Now let's take a look at picture quality. We're going to look at photos and video, and then we're going to take a look at the performance of this phone versus other models. So we're going to start off on the standard camera. This is that 12 megapixel sensor that's been in other Pixel phones, including the recent 4a. And one of the things that I like about this camera is that it's got a very wide 1.7 aperture, so you get a lot of natural blurring even when you're not in portrait mode. So I often say to folks that if this blur level looks adequate, try not to go into portrait mode too often, because you're going to get a nice natural bokeh here, which you can see very clearly here in this image. And you also get a lot of nice detail in the photographs too. And Google does a lot of image processing on these images, so you will get a good picture most of the time, irrespective of lighting conditions. So here's another image I shot out on my front porch. And this was in the shade. And again, a lot of nice detail, really good exposure here. And you don't have to think much about taking the picture. Just snap the picture and the Google algorithm will do the rest here. Really good detail. Now, this image won't win any composition awards, but I do like what it shows us about the Google camera system. First of all, you can see we get a ton of detail out of the tree here. We're even picking up a spider web that's running through it. This was a handheld shot. I just pointed the camera and pushed the button. It's not portrait mode. We're getting just that nice natural bokeh from the wide aperture on the lens. And then the algorithm decided that it needed to apply some HDR to this image, high dynamic range. So even though it's a pretty overcast day, we're getting a lot of nice details out of the cloud. And yes, you'll get a similar image out of other phones that are very good at this computational photography like Apple or Samsung, but it's also working very well here, and I think Google does a really good job, even with an older sensor, delivering this kind of image quality. Now, all that said, if I took that same picture with the Pixel 4a or the Pixel 3 even, you'll probably see a very similar quality image. We're not really advancing much here on the camera, but Google has been improving their algorithms over time, and these phones really do deliver a nice consistent quality to their images. And I was really impressed with the low light performance out of the camera. This was shot in a very dark room that was picking up just a little bit of ambient light from the hallway. And as you can see, the detail here is tremendously good for a handheld shot. Typically, these long exposures will often result in some motion blurring, and although the image is a little bit soft, it really is a lot sharper than I anticipated it would be. And as you can see, there's not a lot of noise on this, even in the shadowy areas of the photo. So I was just blown away by just how good this image was from a handheld shot, just kind of taken at random. But this is an example of the strength of what Google has been able to layer on this sensor through their software algorithms. And check out this low light photo. This was taken with the Astrophotography mode that Google introduced with the Pixel 4 last year. What you have to do is put the phone on a tripod, point it up at the night sky, and it will detect when you're in night sight mode that you're trying to take an astrophotography picture, and it will do a very long exposure. So this was a 4-minute exposure. That big bright dot here is Mars. And as you can see, we're getting a lot of nice detail on the stars. Typically with an SLR camera, if you let it just sit open for 4 minutes, you would see a lot of star trails. We're not getting that here at all. The tree is really nicely detailed, even though we're looking at a 4-minute exposure. Even the little weather vane here at the top has a lot of good detail to it as well. And this is out of a smartphone, not out of an SLR. And just again, totally awesome low light performance out of this camera, and I think you're going to have a lot of fun experimenting out at night with it. Now, of course, the big new feature of the Pixel 5 is its wide-angle lens, which of course picks up a lot more in its field of view versus the standard lens that you can see here. The wide-angle lens, though, is running at a 2.2 aperture, so you're bound to get more noise in the photographs, and there's only so much that the algorithm can do here. It's always better to have the best quality image going in before you start processing things. So this is not going to do as well in lower light, but you are, of course, going to be able to take some really cool wide-angle photos with that new lens. But I do miss the telephoto lens on the Pixel 4, especially when you want to zoom in on something. So here's an image that I went to 2x on, and as you can see, although on screen it looks good, when we start zooming in, you're going to pick up a lot more softness and blurriness because it's essentially doing a digital zoom as opposed to having the actual optics there to deliver that telephoto image. So if you do like the telephoto features of the Pixel 4, you're going to definitely miss them here on the Pixel 5. So let's take a look now at portrait mode, and as you can see, it does a very nice job pulling the subject out of the background, but there will be some glitches. So as you can see here, it did not detect the window in this portion of the photo between her head and the pigtail. And this is the kind of stuff that I notice all the time with these portrait mode algorithmic shots. They're good, but not always perfect. So this will probably work well for Facebook or Instagram, maybe not so much for a print. But you can make some adjustments to this effect after the fact, and I'll show you how to do that in a second. The next shot I want to show you here is of a leaf in my backyard. Again, this is portrait mode now, and you can see it very cleanly cut that leaf out of the background and got everything nicely blurred. But I am very pleased, though, with the natural image that you get out of the lens without the portrait effect added. You can see it does have a nice blur already, although the portrait mode, of course, will make it look much blurrier. And I guess it's up to you as to what you want to see out of those pictures. What's nice is that you get both the regular image that it shot and the portrait image, so you can pick the original if you want to go with that. Here's another shot I did out in the garden. This is a portrait mode photo. Lots of nice detail on the bee there on the flower, so that was really nice. But again, the regular lens does a pretty good job too, I think, but sometimes the portrait mode will help you focus things a little bit more cleanly on what you want people to look at. Now, if you want to adjust your photo, you can jump into Google Photos and load up the image and go over here to adjust. And if you have a portrait mode photo, one of the things you can do is dial down the blur. So for example, if that little spot on her head is too distracting, I can make the background a little less blurry, and that will make it look a little bit better, or perhaps worse, depending on where we adjust that dial. My one disappointment was that I couldn't put this mode into landscape. It has to be in portrait mode, so you will have to zoom in on the image here and kind of make some adjustments as you go. So you can, make some changes to it to make it look a little better, maybe a little less blurry. You can also adjust the depth, so I could have it maybe focus on something else if I wanted to. This is sometimes hit or miss depending on the input image going in, but it's kind of fun to play around with that. You can also adjust what they call the color focus, so I could have the background, for example, lose its color saturation, but keep my daughter in color in the front. And they've got a neat little feature called Portrait Light, which is a virtual light that you can have expose the picture in different ways. So you can see as I'm moving that virtual light around, the light is casting on her face in different ways, kind of like an advanced dodge and burn. So there are some fun little things you can do to adjust the photos. Nothing terribly complicated, and I think that's what's been good about this Google system all around. The camera app is very easy to use. The edits are pretty simple to get going, and I found more often than not, you're going to be pretty happy with whatever picture it takes when you push the button. And I think that's something of use to people who don't like to spend a lot of time messing around with their pictures and just want to get a good image when they first click the shutter. And I found the front-facing camera to deliver good images even though it doesn't have the same level of detail that the rear cameras will have. Good portrait mode, as you can see here, and also the regular image quality is sharp with a lot of fine detail. Should be great for selfies and also good for doing video conferences and that sort of thing. Now, one area where the Pixel phones have always fallen short is on video, and they've made some improvements with this new phone, but it's not quite there yet. Now, it's great to see that the Pixel can now shoot 4K at 60 frames per second. Prior models could not do that. The video is looking better. But it doesn't have the same pizzazz that you might see out of an iPhone or out of some of the more higher-end Android devices from Samsung. Part of the problem, of course, is that the sensor on this phone is getting a little bit old, and it's hard for Google's algorithms to process video as well as it can process photos. So as a result of that, your video is going to look fine. It'll run at 4K at 60 frames per second, but you might see better video detail out of other phones out there on the market that might cost more. But if video is important to you, I think you might want to go in that direction. I was not as blown away with the video quality here, even with the higher frame rate, as I was with the photo quality. And again, that's due to the fact that Google can do a lot of post-image processing to get things looking their best on a still photo, not so much on the video side. Now, in addition to the 4K 60 mode, you can also shoot at 4K 30. There are a number of modes at 1080p, including a 240 frames per second slow motion mode. It does not support, though, 24p. And also, it doesn't appear as though you can shoot video with the wide-angle lens, only the standard lens. So that was a little bit of a disappointment because I do like shooting wide-angle video with my iPhone quite a bit. So some limitations still on the video side. The front camera will do 1080p at 30 frames per second max. Now, there are a number of stabilization modes on the phone. This is the standard mode. Works great even at 4K 60. The phone has built-in optical stabilization, but of course also Google's software stabilization. Then you've got this mode called active, which lets you kind of run around and have a very still image. The one issue, though, with the active stabilization is that even though it does deliver very smooth image quality here, even when you're running around, the resolution takes a hit. So even though I wanted to shoot at 4K 60, it only gave me a 1080p 30 video in that mode. Now, this mode is called cinematic, and it gives you smoother pans, but it also doesn't record audio because it's essentially a slow motion video. So this was a video that I was shooting at 4K 60, but it gave me a 4K 30 with a much smoother pan as I was moving the camera around. So make sure you don't record any audio in that mode. And again, it's going to reduce your frame rate in half. And then they have this mode called locked, which allows you to keep a distant object stable while you move the camera. But as you can see, it introduces some weird effects if you're walking. You can see my footsteps kind of going up and down there, even though that bird remains relatively stable. So this mode I had a hard time finding a good use case for. The image quality isn't so great because it is cropping in a little bit to give it some room to move the frame around. And altogether, that mode was my least favorite of the new stabilization options that it offers. So if you primarily shoot video on your phone, this is probably not the one to get. But what I really like about the Pixel line of phones, and this one is no exception, is how good they are at still images. Point the camera, push the button, and you get a good image 9 times out of 10, irrespective of the amount of light it has to work with. And that's a real strength of all these phones. It continues here, and I think for a lot of consumers that's important to them. And I think the image quality out of this phone at its price is competitive with phones that cost more. And I think that's the value proposition here. Another thing I like about the Pixel phones is that Google makes the hardware and the operating system, and you get a very pure Android experience as a result. This came shipped with Android 11. It is guaranteed to get OS updates for the next 3 years from the time that this phone came out in 2020. So it'll be supported through 2023. So that's good, and you get those updates right away. And then when Google's playing around with new features and whatnot, you often get those features on the Pixel phones before they roll out to others. So that's one reason maybe to consider the Pixel phone. But one thing that really surprised me about this phone is that it's not a real upgrade in performance. So while you're messing around on the screens here and going in between apps, it's going to feel fast and quick and responsive, mostly because it's got that 90 hertz display. But when you start digging into the details and looking at benchmark tests and everything, you'll find that this is really not an upgrade at all. In fact, a significant downgrade in performance from the prior generation. Let's have a look at a couple of benchmarks first, and then we'll take a look at a game or two. So let's start off with the 3D Mark slingshot test, and there the Pixel 5 got a score of 3,963. That is a significant downgrade from the Pixel 4 from last year that on many of the aspects of the test performed almost twice as fast as the new phone here. Really surprising, actually. Take a look also at the Google Pixel 4a. The 5 and the 4a perform at almost identical levels of performance across this entire benchmark, yet the 4a is the budget phone in Google's lineup. Typically, the flagship performs much better than the entry-level phone, but here they're about the same as far as performance is concerned. And we also ran the GeekBench test just to make sure that this slingshot result was not an anomaly. And there the Pixel 5 got a single core score of 585 versus 531 on the 4a. On the multi-core test, we got 1591 versus 1528. So it's within the margin of error here insofar as its performance is concerned. And that was, again, really surprising that the flagship phone would perform the same as the budget one. Now, what does this mean in practice? Well, for the most part, you won't have a hard time finding games and apps to run on it. So this is Call of Duty Mobile. Runs just fine. The frame rate feels fine on it. But a higher-end phone would give you better visual quality. You might have a phone with a higher resolution display, and it would run smoother at that higher resolution. And again, it's surprising that you wouldn't see a more powerful processor in the higher end phone here. And for the most part, the visual quality, the performance on this phone will be the same with Call of Duty as it would be with the Pixel 4a, which costs a lot less. Now, we also tested out Goat Simulator. That's a game that we run on all of the different phones that we review here on the channel. As expected, it ran just fine, despite the fact that this is a phone running at a much lower performance level than its predecessor ran at. But overall, a good experience nonetheless, and I think this will be the experience you'll find with most Android games that you attempt to run on it. One last thing to talk about, and that is the speakers on this phone. They're actually located behind the display. They're these very flat speakers, and they sound pretty good for a very flat speaker, nice and loud and crisp and clear, but you don't get a wide range of sound like you would with a phone with more traditional speakers. So if you're listening to music, I think hooking up some Bluetooth headphones or USB headphones is probably the way to go. But for calls and maybe watching a video casually every once in a while on your phone, it should work fine in that mode. Overall, I think it's a nice phone. I love the design of it. I wish it was more powerful, though. I'm really surprised that Google would be choosing a platform that runs at half the performance level of the predecessor device. That was a big surprise, and as a result, you might see things like photos and other processor-intensive activities running slower on this. And I did notice that photo processing on this phone was slower than it was on the Pixel 4 that we reviewed last year. May not be a big deal to most consumers, but I do think it's something that should give anyone pause who's looking to upgrade from the Pixel 4. Yes, this looks nicer, but it doesn't perform better. And that, I think, is a big disqualifier for a lot of folks, given that we always expect next year's phone to run faster than the prior version. And this one certainly is not doing that. It has regressed, and it performs pretty much at the same performance level as the much less expensive Pixel 4a. So if you're new to the Pixel line of phones and trying to figure out if you want to go with the 5 or the 4a, I would take a look at the unique features of the 5 versus the 4a and decide if those are important to you or not. If those features are not important, the much less expensive 4a here is going to perform almost identically to the flagship model. It also has a great OLED display. It also has a great camera. In fact, the camera here is the same one on this one. And I think you're going to get a lot of value out of the lower price phone and less value out of the higher end one here. And again, I was really disappointed to see this phone not performing much better than the budget one in its lineup. But it still is a pretty solid phone for those who want its unique features. That's going to do it for now. Until next time, this is Lon.TV. Thanks for watching.
This channel is brought to you by the Lon.TV supporters, including gold level supporters Tom Albrecht, Chris Allegretta, Mike Patterson, and Bill Pomerantz. If you want to help the channel, you can by contributing as little as $1 a month. Head over to lon.tv/support to learn more. And don't forget to subscribe. Visit lon.tv/s.